There is an unprecedented level of movement and conversation in Indian football. Although the game has been in the country for decades, it's only been within the last decade, or more so within the last 5 years, that the game in India has started to get more global recognition. It's becoming more internationally relevant. That international presence, though, begs the question, does international football law matter in India? And if so, why? This is an important question to ask because the international football market has had several decades to grow and fine-tune a set of laws and policies that govern the sport globally. How then can India, or rather should India, be taking leaves out of the international football law to enhance the governance of game in India? I invite Mr. John Lofhagen, consultant with Onside Law, to help us answer that question.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm competing with Rice and a late arrival, but I'll do what I can to keep it interesting. I wanted to start by thanking Nandan and the rest of the team for putting these couple of days on. It must take a huge amount of work, and having been in Delhi last year, it was a fascinating couple of days, and this time around looks as good, if not better. So thank you to them, and apologies that I'm not sporting a sports top. I'm afraid I seem to have turned into a part-time travel agent. I have two daughters in India who keep wanting to change their flights and hotels and God knows what, and it just slipped my mind. So you'll have to use your imagination and imagine me wearing what I would have worn, which is the England ODI cricket top, in recognition of our thumping victory over New Zealand. There was a suggestion over dinner last night that perhaps England and New Zealand should share the World Cup, which I thought was outrageous, given the result was never in doubt. So why does international football law matter to India? And I want to start by giving a very brief bit of introduction about myself, and you'll see why in a second. I worked for many years at IMG and started to work in connection with things Indian in 2007 when I got involved in the IPL. And I've got to say it was an absolute privilege to be able to work on IPL for 11 seasons in terms of the contracts, the regulations, etc. Total roller coaster, as you all know, those of you who followed the IPL, but it was great to be a part of it. And during my time with IMG, I then, when IMG formed its JV with Reliance, I worked with my colleagues at IMG Reliance from 2010, from my part really until about 2015, when we acquired certain rights to football in the AIFF in what I now understand is a public master rights agreement. And then we set up, after a period of time, we set up the Indian Super League. So I have some kind of direct, I suppose, involvement in that, although I like to think, but I suppose we all do, that I'm independent-minded, and I've left IMG and IMG Reliance now anyway, so it's whatever I've got to say is hopefully totally neutral. So as you mentioned, and I was wondering when you were going to stop, because I'm sat there thinking perhaps he's just going to say all the things I'm going to say, but there couldn't be many more interesting times to be talking about Indian football. Now what I'm going to do is brief look at Indian football, then the structure of how international football is structured from a regulation point of view, and then look at why it matters to India, what India can take from it, and perhaps at times what India might not either want to or be able to take from it at this point. So one of the things that I hadn't really realised till I read it somewhere a couple of weeks ago was that the four most populous countries in the world, India, China, US and Indonesia, none of them qualify for the 2018 World Cup. So you're not alone in clearly having one or two problems about achieving excellence at the professional level of sport in India. And whilst I'm not as involved as I used to be, if the press is to be believed, and I know there is an if there, Indian football at the professional level again seems to be at of an impasse. In fact, I was in Mumbai on Monday, I think it was, reading the Times of India over breakfast, and Kushal Das, General Secretary of the AIFF, described it as a crisis. I think those were his words. And that crisis seems to be a battle between a traditional league, the I-League, which ran from 2007, still runs, federation organised, open league, by which I mean promotion relegation, as against the upstart, shall we say, on the new kid on the block from 2014, the ISL, which is sanctioned by the AIFF, but privately owned teams, closed, and there seems to be a battle going on for supremacy, if you believe what you read, with the prize being not only status as the premier football league in India, but also access, of course, to the AFC Champions League, etc. It's interesting, be very interesting for me as an outsider just to see how that plays out. In the background of that, and no doubt to some extent connected, there seemed to have been to date, as far as I'm aware, non-published report from the AFC into the current state of Indian football and recommendations as to where it should go from here. And if you believe what I've read, that would involve a combination of the two leagues, promotion relegation, and some form of independent committee to oversee that transition. Allied to that, and I have no idea whether there's much truth in this, I also read that there's potentially the appointment of an ombudsman to oversee an examination of the AIFF constitution. Well, if the Loder Committee reforms of BCCI are anything to go by, if the same process happens with football, then those involved in the federation will see some pretty dramatic changes taking place. So all of that, I guess, we'll all have to wait and see how that plays out. In terms of international football law, there's a kind of, I suppose, a semi-cliched debate about whether there is such a thing as sports law, or is it, when you say someone you're a sports lawyer? I tend to use that because otherwise when you tell someone that you're a lawyer, they immediately think you appear in court, wear a wig, etc. Now, much as a wig would come in handy, I tend to say sports lawyer to distinguish myself in that sense. But most of the time, what I do is practice contract law or whatever other principle of law in a sporting context, and I suspect most of us do. That said, if there is a sport that can lay claim to having its own law, I think football's probably up there. We've had in the UK, we've had legislation specifically for football in terms of supporters, etc. So, yeah, it's an interesting debate, but as I say, I don't intend to go into it in any great detail because it's more of academic interest than anything else. So turning to how international football is structured, it like certain other federations takes the form of a pyramid with, if you imagine, with FIFA at the very top, responsible for administration and governance of the game, although not, interestingly, the laws of the game, which I always found slightly quaint, I guess. Under FIFA and recognised by it are the confederations, those bodies responsible for the administration of football across multiple countries, with AFC looking after India, of course, UEFA looking after England, etc. And then under those confederations sit what are called the member associations, national associations. In India, the AIFF, in the UK for England, FA. And those member associations are directly members both of their relevant confederation, but also of FIFA. They pay a fee, they're members, there's a contractual link. So in that sense, FIFA and the confederations have leverage. Beneath the member associations are a whole myriad of people with whom FIFA and the confederations have no link. These are obviously players, clubs, leagues, coaches. And the way in which FIFA, being FIFA, tries to exert leverage, control, etc., over that myriad of non-linked people is through a kind of a chain of command, a linked chain and procurement obligations, largely. There is an obligation on each association to be the only official body in the country for football. There is an obligation on it to adopt statutes which are compliant, consistent with FIFA statutes, and then, most importantly of all, in terms of trying to establish that link, an obligation to procure compliance by players, etc., with FIFA statutes. So that's the way that there ends up being some form of link between FIFA and those who actually play and run the game at a grassroots level. Now, whilst there might be an international set of football law and regulations, it can't operate in isolation, of course. BCCI found out that it couldn't operate in isolation when it came across the Supreme Court, and the FA and other leagues and confederations have found the same thing. As I say, they are operating in their domestic country, so applicable law will apply in the UK. That will mean UK employment laws govern the relationship between players and their EPL clubs and all the other clubs, and that can mean that a club is vicariously liable, for example, for what the player may do on the pitch. Common law principles of restraint of trade apply to sport, very well established, and to football in particular. And of course, then you step outside domestic law and you have applicable international law. And for the UK, and it'd be interesting to see for how much longer, EU law applies to sport. Sport is seen as a business, and EU principles apply. And perhaps the most famous case remains the Bosman case, where principles of freedom of movement were held to apply to football transfers, and for what I believe is the first time, footballers were free agents on the expiry of their contract. So it is, I think India is the same as the UK at the moment, although I think there are steps to perhaps introduce a national sports code. But in the UK, there isn't the equivalent of the loi du sport, which is there is in France, where the federation gets its right to be direct from the state. Anyone else could set up a football association in the UK. They just wouldn't be recognised, and anyone who played would be unofficial. But they still have to apply themselves and work in a way which is consistent with applicable law. So how can FIFA and its set of rules and regulations help a country like India at its stage of development in improving the game, both at the elite level, but also, to my mind, almost, if not more importantly, at grassroots level? And I think, and you alluded to the fact that the advantage of a set of rules and regulations is of the type that FIFA has, is that it has gone through a number of evolutions. It has tried to address a number of situations over the years. So in that sense, you're getting the benefit of a developed system of regulation of a sport. And in introducing it en masse, as it were, and having to comply with this international body of rules and regulations, it perhaps removes what might be the domestic political infighting that might occur, I guess, if one body tried to introduce a similar set of rules. It can simply be said, well, we have to do it this way because those are the rules that FIFA insists we comply with. And there are a number of rules that FIFA has promulgated, the regulations, and I know they're going through a certain reworking at the moment, and we'll hear more about that later. But there are a number, I think, that can be of real value to India, and really it makes no sense in many ways, although I will come back and caveat that a little later. It makes no sense in many ways to sit and wait for football to develop economically in the way it has elsewhere and then introduce a whole load of safeguards, etc. Why not put those things in place in anticipation of what we all hope will be the growth and development of football in India? And as I say, there are a number of them. Starting off and going back to what I mentioned before, FIFA insists on there being one official body for the sport. And whilst that might sound monopolistic, and it obviously is, the advantage for a sport in any country in having one official body is one only needs to realise the advantage when you look at what happens when there are two bodies vying for control of a particular sport, as happened, for example, in India a year or two ago in basketball. And that cannot help the efficient development and growth of a sport if there are two bodies both fighting to be the official body for the sport. And there are a number of others. There are the obligation for office bearers in official bodies to be democratically elected. There are detailed provisions that provide protection for minors, which is obviously incredibly important. And when one thinks of potentially international transfers of children, boys, sorry, I can't read that, I don't know how my glasses are. 5 minutes, did that say 5 minutes? Wow, okay, right, I need to speak quickly. Is that because we're falling behind or I'm just dragging on? Right, okay, well, I've got to be really quick then. Okay, well, forgive me, I'm now going to speak quickly. So, protections for minors from transfers in the sense of trying to ensure that those transfers are prohibited unless there are guarantees of things such as education, etc. Prohibition on third-party influence over the relevant member association. So government interference generally in the administration of the sport is prohibited by FIFA, and they will suspend a country if they think that the national association has been taken over by the government. Third-party ownership of players, particularly South American players in the past, has been a real issue where the interests of the player and the club he's playing for don't necessarily coincide with someone who only makes money when that player moves club. That said, I don't think you can simply have a one-size-fits-all for a country like India and adopt everything. For example, club licensing regulations are probably not realistic at the moment for a country like India. And conversely, I think India could adopt player agent regulations, which are actually better in many ways than the current FIFA agents regulations, where the previous set seem to have been diluted. So a number of things I think that India can and probably should take on board and develop. And I'm now going to have to really hurry. But if the question is, can international football law make a significant difference right now, the adoption of FIFA regulations, can it make a difference right now to the development of football at the elite level? The answer is I'm not sure it can. I'm not sure, for example, that AFC commissioning two non-Indians to travel around and ask people questions and then impose what I believe seems to be a 6 non-Indian man transition committee to oversee the implementation of the amalgamation of the ISL and the I-League. I would say good luck with that, because that is an incredibly difficult task. That would be incredibly difficult in any country, let alone India. So I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all. I think it has to be to use a cooking analogy, I was thinking about this the other day. You know, you take something like an omelette. Great, who doesn't like an omelette? But India has the masala omelette. And I think in many ways, that's the approach that India has to take. It has to choose those of the things that suit it at the moment. And really, right now, in terms of the elite, whether it's the I-League or the ISL, I don't actually think it matters, because sad to say, right now, Indians are not good enough at football to demand eyeballs. Not significant eyeballs, not enough eyeballs. And when you can watch EPL and when you can watch La Liga, then you watch those in preference to ISL, sadly, in huge numbers. And the reason people love IPL is because Indians are great cricketers. And if it was just full of foreigners, I suspect you'd be in the same situation. So really, what I think, if I were involved in Indian football, would be not to abandon the elite. Obviously, you try and develop that in the best way possible. But I would throw a huge amount of attention to the bottom of my pyramid and grassroots, and get your structures right, and get your coaches right, and get your talent identification right. And then sheer weight of numbers. Sooner or later, you're not going to have to worry about the elite, because the elite will be there, and India will take pride in qualifying for the World Cup, as we all hope it will. And at that point, all the structures and safeguards that hopefully you've put in place will really bear fruit. And I'm obviously out of time, but I'd just take the opportunity to wish everyone who's involved in it the very best of luck. I genuinely mean that. It's incredibly difficult. I know that people are vying with competing interests, all hoping for the best in Indian football. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.